relation to this topic, in relation to this topic, we can't skip over the effect of this nation's horrific history in regards to slavery, in the delayed emancipation, which we do celebrate with today's holiday. Today's showing of the Harvard and Legacy of Slavery documentary will help connect the dots from the past and what this means for institutions today. And the April 22 documentary, created by the Harvard Legacy of Slavery Strategic Advisory Board, is meant to introduce the university's ties to slavery and the university's ties directly in regards to the Harvard community. In just a few moments, we'll begin the documentary, and then followed by that, we'll have a discussion or Q&A with today's panelists, Professor Tony Clark and Dr. Jerome Offord. Dr. Jerome Offord sits as the Associate University Librarian for Anti-Racism at Harvard University and is also a Dean of Administrations and Student Affairs as a former interim provost of Lincoln University, which is in STEAM HBCU in Missouri. And then Professor Tony Clark is a tenured professor, author, and co-founder and co-president of My Brother's Keeper, Cambridge Task Force. He holds degrees from Morehouse College, New York University, and the City University, New York, as well as being a member of the Harvard Legacy of Slavery Strategic Advisory Board. I thank you all for being here. I thank the panelists so much for being here, taking the time to support my initiative. And without further delay, we will begin the film.
Hold on, let me think about that. Yeah. I do talk with my hands.
My mother went here, her father went here. Growing up, I saw the school as the best of the best. I didn't know the stories that were hidden in the walls around this campus.
You think of Harvard as this quintessential perfect place with ivy along the walls. But as you learn about its history, you think about some of the ugliness that went into building these buildings.
This history is all around us. In a way, we live in a landscape of enslavement.
The United States for some time has been focused on the issue of slavery and its legacies.
There's a sense of urgency to dealing with this now, partially because it should have been done in the past. We are at the point in which we have the opportunity to either carry with us the biases of the past or reimagine what our future worlds could look like.
In the case of Harvard, the obligation of the institution is to uncover that past and to come to terms with it.
Veritas is the motto of Harvard University. On our shield, the word is displayed across 3 open books, suggesting both our mission of education and the transparency that's demanded of us. Even when it's painful, we must face the truth.
It's time to document what actually is our legacy. We have to turn around and ask ourselves, what were we doing? Why were we doing it? What does it mean for who we are now?
People have this image of Harvard University being an ivory tower, as if it's separated from the world, as if it's above the world. But there's no separation from the world. There's no place outside history.
I started looking into the history of Harvard and slavery in 2007. I read a report written by a committee at Brown University about Brown's connection to slavery. I wondered if there is not a similar story to be told about Harvard.
The conventional story of slavery is about plantation slavery in the southern states. Even well-read people just don't know about the history of slavery in the North.
It's easy to say, well, Massachusetts is not in the South, that slavery was abolished very early, and so it couldn't have had that great of an impact on the institution. Earlier generations of Harvard leaders just thought it was better left unspoken and unexamined.
But I think a full accounting for Harvard's history has to begin with colonization in the Americas.
Many indigenous peoples lost their lives and lost their freedoms as a result of the encroachment of English settlers. Harvard University was built on and still exists on taken Native American lands.
The Charter of 1650, which still governs Harvard, called for the education of English and Indian youth. And yet in the 17th century, many indigenous Americans were enslaved, and Harvard only gave a degree to one Native student. So we have this tension between the principles that Harvard has espoused and the practices that it's followed.
The truth is that the university drew in all kinds of ways on the labor of enslaved people.
We've uncovered that more than 70 people, 70 human beings, were owned by Harvard leadership, faculty, staff, from the founding of the university through 1783, when slavery was made unlawful in Massachusetts.
The evidence of the legacy of slavery at Harvard is in the landscape. You can go to the old burial ground and you can see the headstones for two enslaved people. One of them, a girl named Cicely, was enslaved to William Brattle, who was a tutor, a treasurer, and a fellow at Harvard University.
We also know that several of Harvard's presidents who lived in Wadsworth House, which is still standing on campus today, owned enslaved people of African origins, among them Venus, Bila, and Juba.
Titus also is someone who was enslaved on Harvard's campus, and he is believed to have been of indigenous and possibly also of African descent.
That was the thing that people did. They bring their, what they would call servants, but they would, in many instances, be enslaved people.
Those enslaved people supported Harvard presidents. They fed Harvard students. They were part of daily life at Harvard.
But this is just a small part of our story of how we are involved with the institution of slavery.
The New England economy was very much tied to slavery in the South and slavery in the Caribbean as well. That's really the Harvard story.
In the 17th and 18th centuries, Boston was a kind of economic suburb of the Caribbean. New Englanders who had the resources would move to the Caribbean, invest in the plantation sector, and strike it rich.
That wealth can be clearly seen in an 18th century plantation house, still standing just a couple of miles from Harvard's campus. This was the home of the Royals, Isaac Royal Sr. and his son, Isaac Royal Jr.
The Royals are a good example of Harvard's entanglement with the institution of slavery.
The Royals made their money off sugar plantations in the island of Antigua, but it wasn't easy money.
In 1736, Antigua's plantation owners became fearful that enslaved workers were plotting against them, and they decided to crack down.
The royal family was involved in putting down this slave uprising. A lot of head chopping, decapitations to make people as examples, burning people.
Then Isaac Royal Sr. migrated back to New England to his huge property, several hundred acres of land. He brought enslaved workers from the Caribbean to Medford to work. Eventually, Isaac Royal Jr. donates lands to Harvard University, which the university then sells and uses to endow the first professorship of law at Harvard University.
And some people take that as the founding of the Harvard Law School.
So in many ways, the origins of one of the world's greatest law schools, namely Harvard Law School, is directly to be found in the exploitation of enslaved workers on the sugar plantations of Antigua. But we cannot think of these donations only as something that happened a long time ago.
Isaac Royal made his money in the 18th century, and yet Harvard Law School in the 21st century still has an Isaac Royal chair named for that original gift.
And Isaac Royal was just one of many donors to the university who made their money, at least in part through slavery and the slave trade.
Their gifts allowed the university to add buildings, infrastructure, to hire faculty, expand the student body. So in a real way, the proceeds from slavery helped Harvard become the Harvard we know today.
So money derived from slave labor contributed to Harvard. But Harvard also produced and advanced some of the racist ideas that underpinned the system of slavery and justified segregation and racial subjugation long after slavery ended.
One of the most influential race scientists at Harvard was a man named Louis Agassiz.
Louis Agassiz came to Harvard in 1847 from Switzerland, where he had made a reputation for himself as a person studying comparative anatomy. A major question at the time was, how do we understand human variation? How do we understand that some groups have dark skin, some groups have lighter skin?
Agassiz becomes one of the major progenitors of the theory of polygenesis, the notion that human races are actually separate species, and God, rather than creating humanity in one moment, i.e. Adam and Eve, created 5 different Adam and Eves.
Agassiz argued that there were major anatomical, physiological, intellectual differences between human groups, that white Americans/Europeans were at the top of a hierarchy, and Africans, dark-skinned, black-skinned peoples were at the bottom.
The story of Stormon, of a Black man from Southern Africa, reminds us of how tragedy was at the bottom of racial science.
It's such a horrible story. 2 American men went to Southern Africa. They ended up bringing back 5 men from different tribes here to Boston, having them displayed, dressed in quote unquote native garb. Come and see these interesting, very, very different people.
These 5 men are put on display at the Aquarial Gardens. They were supposed to hold their spears and beads and sing songs for gawking audience members.
Among these men was a young man whose name we now pronounce Stormon.
Stormon is a particularly tragic figure. He's only 17 years old. At the end of about 6 months to a year of being on display, he takes his own life. He hangs himself. But Stormon's tragedy doesn't end with his death. When Stormon kills himself, they give his body to Harvard.
Harvard faculty member Jeffries Wyman conducted a dissection of Stormon's body, and they also made a set of casts of his body that remains in the Harvard Peabody Museum collections.
His skeleton is turned into a teaching tool. They say it's left in the care, what irony, of Professor Louis Agassiz. Stormon is measured and put in a linear position anatomically between whites and great apes. So not only is his body being destroyed, he's also being turned into this point of data to prove his own inferiority.
Once you start saying that there are fundamental and innate differences between human groups, which is what Agassiz argued, that provides a justification for slavery. And it played a major role in the ways in which inequality became so deeply embedded in American society. for white students here at Harvard, those ideas serve as a context in which they can say, we can't be in the same room and study with these people who are not our equals.
In 1850, when Harvard Medical School takes its first attempt at desegregating, Oliver Wendell Holmes Sr., the father of the famous Supreme Court Justice, had been the professor of anatomy at Harvard for 3 years and was then the dean of the medical school.
3 African-American men were admitted to the medical school.
The famous abolitionist Martin Delany, and then 2 local students, David Lang Jr. and Isaac H. Snowden.
White Harvard Medical School students were in an uproar about the presence of these Black men in their classes.
They protested. They wrote a rageful letter threatening to leave the university if the students were admitted.
Wendell Holmes succumbed to the pressure. Those students, those Black men, were expelled from Harvard Medical School. And for many years, well into the 20th century, the number of African-American students studying at Harvard Medical School remained smaller than many other medical schools in this country.
The expulsions were because of pushback from students and faculty and some alumni. At the same time, there were students who wrote letters, they raised their voices, they said that it was wrong to expel those students.
There's a through line there that every time there has been a legacy of racism, a legacy of slavery, a legacy of domination, there is also a legacy of resistance. I would even call it a tradition of resistance that runs through Harvard as well.
People like Charles Hamilton Houston, Eva Beatrice Dykes, and W.B. Du Bois, who of course is a towering intellect, who is a co-founder of the Niagara movement, which becomes the NAACP.
Du Bois was the first African-American to earn a PhD from Harvard, but he did not feel that he was particularly welcomed in the Harvard community.
It was, to some degree, a lonely existence for Du Bois. He famously said that he was in Harvard, but not of it. And yet he and many others in Harvard's history, having experienced discrimination and exclusion, made invaluable contributions that led to the remaking of America, that led to the fall of Jim Crow, to the passage of the Civil Rights Act, to the Voting Rights Act. The history of Harvard is entangled with change making in this country. And so the history and the counter history are all bound up together.
So what do you do when you discover the institution has a dark past? That its history is not just heroic, but it's also ironic, tragic.
I think there's a natural inclination not to confront ugly things. Somebody who's uncomfortable, I would say, you don't have the luxury of comfort in every situation.
If you are of a marginalized community, we live in a space of discomfort. And so what we're asking is for people of dominant culture to live in this discomfort with us.
One thing I would want to stress for people is that it is not your fault slavery happened, but by virtue of attending this university, it is our duty to bring light to those injustices.
Reckoning with history means that we look with eyes wide open at the layers of experience, often painful layers of experience that undergird this place.
The process that we're all being invited into is to not think of this as just Black history or just about slavery. It's about us as much as it is about a legacy.
In the past few years, we have begun to take some small steps to engage this history, to grapple with how we can address some of the damages that we have done
One of the first ways that people reckon with this history is they want to change or rearrange the symbolic landscape.
The royal family crest was 3 sheaves of wheat. And in the 1930s, Harvard decided to use the royal family crest for the law school because of their connection to the law school.
When students learned this, they protested it.
So the law school made a committee. I was on the committee, and Bruce Mann was the chair of the committee. And we came to the conclusion that the shield should be withdrawn. I was a dissenter in that.
Professor Annette Gordon-Reed believes quite powerfully, quite persuasively, that we need symbols to remind us.
My concern was I did not want this story to be forgotten. That was my thinking. It would be important to keep this alive, to make Harvard's ties to this something that they couldn't walk away from.
The important thing with Isaac Royal, when people think, oh, you're just judging a man of the 18th century by 21st century standards, no, that's not it at all. The question for us was whether a man of the 18th century should represent the Harvard Law School of the 21st century.
So you put up a plaque, you replace a shield, but that's just the beginning of the process. A real reckoning, a real taking responsibility for this history is to think about how we apply ourselves to the future.
Harvard University has a deep history. We as an institution are engaging with that history because it's in that search that we discover as a community who we are.
If Harvard does not continue its process of reckoning, that sends a message that that is something that can be researched, written about, relegated to a drawer somewhere, and then, we did it. Let's move on.
Slavery is a sin that can never be undone. One of the fundamental truths that our community needs to confront is that the effects of slavery endure today.
The key is not to hide it. And the whole initiative about looking at slavery, looking at the ties to slavery is about veritas. It's about truth.
In this reckoning, it requires more than just an acknowledgement of history, but also a commitment to the future as well. The task of right now is figuring out how to turn that into practice.
The report and recommendations are just a beginning. If Harvard was not a leader years ago on the issue of racial inequality, it can be a leader today.
The Legacy of Slavery project is as powerful as we allow it to be. Let's let it be powerful.
All right. So without further ado, we'd like to get right into our panel. First, I want to start with a question for Professor Clark. The term discomfort is used a number of times throughout the film, with marginalized community members living in a space of discomfort almost always. For change to happen, members of the dominant culture must live in discomfort with us. Can you share why it's important to have these necessary, albeit sensitive conversations, like the ones that are kind of exemplified throughout the film and in different places that we've spoken about?
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you for organizing this. It's fascinating for a number of reasons, because I think that we're in a place in our country's history where, as much as we want to grapple with that particular term in which you use discomfort, there still seems to be an apprehension to really radically address it from both a policy perspective, and as you know, you're seeing as a maybe what you're seeing as a student, and we'll see at the college level in a couple of years, is that there seems to be an opportunity to have these conversations with young people, but when those conversations don't go according to plan, it's like you are the pariah of sorts. And so I think it's very much analogous to being Black in America from the standpoint, particularly a Black adult. Oftentimes, we treat Black adults like children and treat Black children like adults. And part of it is discomfort of having a relationship with their humanity. And so these conversations, to me or for me, have become discomfortable for the people who don't really want to have them in the first place. And I think at the same time, we have to be conscientious, and I say we as conscious people, that is a strategy to make folks feel as though these conversations aren't important or they're not worthy to have. And so it's a great question. It's a tough question, but I think part of it is by design.
Yeah, I mean, I 100% agree. I think that a lot of the conversations that we're supposed to be having, or that it seems like are necessary to further, and advance us as a people, are ones that, do have some sort of taboo undertone to most, even though, I mean, as we've discussed and we've seen in the film, it's been a history where a lot of these topics have had severe consequences, and to sort of, mediate some of these harder conversations are a deep necessity to advance, anything.
Definitely.
And my next question is for Dr. Offord. In the film, Professor Brown speaks on how the legacy of slavery can be found, simply walking around the campus of Harvard. Do you believe that the makers or these markers throughout Harvard's campus should be acknowledged during prospective student tours? Should they be renamed? Should they be replaced? How should the school kind of go about it, this evidence of the past that is seen throughout the campus?
Well, good morning, Nigel and colleagues. Thank you again for the invitation. I am thoroughly enjoying this, and I'm very proud of you as a young person bringing up this topic and providing information to the community. Yes, I think the monuments to our enslaved and indigenous peoples who were enslaved at Harvard should remain as markers, should remain as a part of the fabric of the institution. And the institution has created a Harvard and Legacy of Slavery tour. It's about a 2-hour tour that actually facilitates people navigating the monuments that we know of that are on and near campus. And so as a part of the Harvard Legacy of Slavery, one of the recommendations was to build a memorial on campus. And so I am on that committee, and we are looking at how the institution can build a monument or memorial to acknowledge slavery and acknowledge those that were enslaved on campus. As far as the campus tours, I'm not sure if they are integrated in prospective students tours. I do know that at one point in time, the Harvard Legacy of Slavery book was a common read for several of the schools on campus, the professional schools, and not for the college, as we call it, which are the undergraduates. Excuse me. But I think the institution is looking at how to incorporate the legacy of slavery as it does its descendant research, as it looks into the memorial, as it looks into other ways to reckon or acknowledge the implicit or passive ways that Harvard were involved in slavery.
Yes, thank you so much. And my next question is going to be to both of our panelists. There's a lot of energy surrounding sort of trending language such as belonging and mattering, and different topics surrounding this idea of diversity, equity, inclusion in educational spaces, but also increasingly mixed messages and feelings around this topic and this point of interest. So can you speak on the importance of campuses and communities in kinship, both, in PWIs and HBCUs, and sort of relating and having a sense of belonging, a sense of mattering for students of color throughout these different educational spaces?
You want to go first, Brother Clark?
You can go, Dr. Offord.
Sure. So, wonderful question. So, belonging, as I've had the opportunity to attend both an HBCU and a PWI, several PWIs and types of PWIs. I will tell you, the HBCU environment, belonging naturally happens as far as identity as a Black man. I think places where HBCUs need to work on belonging is other intersectional identities, which they still kind of have not navigated. But I would tell you, as a Black man with Black history, understanding slavery, understanding the connections to Jim Crow, to my grandparents, and all those experiences, the HBCU was able to allow me to navigate those easier because so many other folks identified as myself. And then my institution, Lincoln University, Missouri, is the only HBCU founded by African American Civil War veterans. Of course, they had support and help from white officers at that time who was teaching them to read and write during the war, which is why they pledged a year's worth of their salary to start the institution. So that's ingrained in us, connected directly to slavery and the Emancipation Proclamation as Lincoln alums. So belonging and the pride, of which I'll take as the next step at the HBCU level, is something that's there. In PWI spaces, I think, and Dr. Clark mentioned this, is that we have to prepare for even more white fragility. They started the conversation around it, and that's the foundation of all the anti-DEI work that's happening right now. Is the common response is, well, I'm not responsible for slavery. I didn't do it. It was my ancestors. And I think one of the profound quotes that I heard yesterday is that you don't have to be a part of the history, but you have to reckon with the history. And so knowing that generational wealth, privilege, rules, systemic issues were all created during colonization, and folks still benefit from that today, including at some of our PWI institutions. And so it is important that people continue to stay the course to help dismantle some of that work and really find ways for institutions to review policies, procedures, recruitment, all activities around how it perceives people of color experiencing their campus environment.
I think Dr. Offord hit it on the head. I mean, like, I also went to an HBCU and several PWIs. I would just kind of like to stay in a particular space that Dr. Offord had highlighted was policy. To pivot a little bit, but not totally from the institutional space, I sit on a board of a particular company. And there was a conversation about their DEI work 2 days ago. Today's Thursday, so Wednesday, so yesterday actually, at our quarterly board meeting. And it was clear that they were making a decision to move away from this particular work, but they didn't want to say it explicitly. Right. And if you were and so as I started to kind of look at our meeting notes from the last maybe 3 to 4 meetings, it's clear that that part of the work was either being parceled out to other particular parties, but it wasn't embedded within this particular corporation. And some on this call may know this, but I know that I would assume Dr. Offord is very familiar with Kendall Square. And if you know Kendall Square, one would argue it's one of the most innovative miles in the world. There's a lot of money that goes through there. And this particular institution is in Kendall Square. And at the height of George Floyd, the height of the George Floyd conversation, it was like, how can we do this work, right? How can we do this work? And there was a pledge, and I'm trying to be as evasive, but tell the story as best as I can, because I don't want to out anybody. But a lot of, but a 9-figure pledge around DEI, but from this particular organization was going to be, earmarked. And nothing, maybe $2 million has been spent, but outside of the dollars, the language has shifted to a point where it's like, they clearly did not want to have that conversation. They weren't prepared to have that conversation. And I would even dare to say they were not interested. And now they're like, we are just blatantly feeling emboldened that we don't need to have that conversation. And so it's been a very interesting journey in these spaces. So while I mentioned that not to to move us away from the conversation around the institutional space, but we also have to be conscientious. Institutions have alumni, right? And those alumni are interconnected to some of the decisions that are not only made it on the campus, the campus perspective, but also how the giving trickles up or trickles down or trickles away. So just wanted to say that.
And I would add to that those same alums are the people working in the companies that you're talking about. So
right.
Attitudes and the thoughts that they come from their generational wealth, from their experience in institutions of higher learning, transition to their leadership roles in corporations and institutions, nonprofits, wherever they migrate to work.
Yep.
Yes, that was so great. Thank you, both of you. We'll have a couple more questions, and then also the audience can submit some questions through the chat option. So if anybody has anything they would like to deposit or would like to ask, feel free to put the questions in the chat. But the next question for both of our panelists is kind of more relating to a situation that probably a lot of the audience is familiar with, either being a high school student about to go into the college realm, or being a parent of a high school or college student of color. I currently attend a school that that fosters respect and for a variety of multiple students, multiple cultures, traditions, belief, identities, all the different backgrounds. How can I personally, or another student in my sort of situation, prepare for a college experience where commitments to inclusivity or diversity may be shifting towards a more positive or negative route? How can I sort of put myself in the place to have the best experience based around these conversations and these sort of changes throughout this area and realm of DEI?
I'll start with saying this. I think part of our challenges, and I'll own this as a Black man, is that because we deal with, I won't even call them microaggressions, macroaggressions daily in our lives. So much of what we believe in around racism and anti-racism and a lot of the work that we do is very emotional. And if you want to shut people down, especially those who are not ready to deal with their emotions around this topic, be very emotional. And I would say that means that we need to understand how to have this conversation with people and not be overly emotional about it, because I think we as American people in general are just emotionally suppressed about a lot of things. And we've been taught that you don't bring emotions and certain things to conversations. But I think we have to find ways to create meaningful dialogue that really focuses on how people can change behavior. I think a lot of our DEI work is troubled because we always try to create a metrics, in which it's a part of white supremacy culture. Everything has to be measured. Everything has to be done a certain way. We have to have a proof that it's working. But slavery was a very strong and emotional and humanistic issue, as well as systemic racism. You don't change that by metrics. You don't change that by just hiring brown and Black people. You don't change that by hiring more women of color. It has to be conversations around human change, and humans make the change. And if you cannot make a human connection to people about this topic, we're going to continue to hit a brick wall, because we want to have some form of metric and some form of documentation to show that we did X, Y, and Z, and that does not move the needle. That's performative. But this is a human issue, and it has to be dealt from a human level.
I totally concur. I think that a couple of things, particularly the human perspective, and one thing, I guess, a kind of a piece of advice that someone has recently just given me. Actually, last night I was having a conversation about how I wanted to help a particular institution, and so part of, and I was like, I want to help them, and I'm going to help them see this, I'm going to help them see that, and I had to take a step back. That's their issue, right? It's kind of like, you have to figure that out on your own, right? And so I would equate it to, one of my well-intended white friends and say, we're going to do this, we're going to do that. And I'm like, talk to your people, right? You know what I mean? Like those talk to, not that those are your people, these are my people, but you got to talk to particular folks to help them understand how you got to the place in which you got to, right? And I think that's important. I also think as well in terms of it's not your job as I don't think it's your job or responsibility as an 18, 19, 20, 22, whatever year old to try to change a system that has been the way in which it's been for years. However, it's important for you to kind of figure out how you are going to engage that system, right? And so, as was mentioned around the emotive space, are you going to go to a meeting and already be prepared? A good friend of mine, Frank Barnes, is on a call right now. We were at an education meeting last night, and it was clear that one of the commissioners clearly went into the situation and wanted to attack this young brother who was presenting information. And my question, and I posed this to this particular person via text this morning, was, and not to racialize it, but in terms of, was that necessary? Was that a conversation? Because they were in the same space. Could you have had a pre-conversation with this particular individual? However, it had very little to do with the questions around the educational needs of this particular group. It was more like, how am I going to grandstand and belittle this brother, right? And it had, and so I think and then there was a conversation. Well, he should this, he should that, he should that. And I was like, well, what good would that have done? Because the other 7 commissioners just stood there, so that institution was okay with the way in which the particular presenter was being treated. And so I don't know if I'm answering your question, but I would just say is that in terms of, it's important to understand that some of these systems have been there for years. That doesn't mean that they can't be disrupted. A question that you had earlier doesn't mean people shouldn't be uncomfortable. But I think it's critically important to understand why you're there, what your goals are, what your intentions are, what are you looking to get out of this experience, and understand that it's not your job, in my opinion, to rewrite the way in which some people have done some things historically. And so that would be my perspective, from that particular standpoint.
Yeah, I want to thank.
I know I didn't answer your question at all, but I just got Dr. Offord said, be careful with your emotions, but I got emotive there. But hopefully I was helpful.
And let me be clear, because I saw it come up in the chat. I'm not saying that we should shy away from our emotions. I just think there's a time and place for it.
Sure.
I think we rely on emotions and storytelling so much that sometimes it gets into the barrier of being able to translate our message. So no, I'm not saying shy away from your emotions. I am a Black man who accepts and embraces emotions quite often. I'll give you an example. When President Claudine Gay resigned or was forced to resign, whatever the politics are, and then they started attacking other Black women who were doing DEI research on campus. I sat with my boss and said, I don't want to be around white people. I literally said that. I said, I'm going to work remote from home. I just don't want to be around white people right now. And it's not that I hate white people. It's just that when systemic oppression shows up, there's a time when you may not, I just didn't want to be around them without any definition. And that took bravery for me to do that. I didn't worry about my job. I didn't worry about my career. Just like, I need mental health space because right now this is not the value that Harvard sold me when it hired me.
Right. And to that point, just want to build off that. And I'm like I said, I want to be respectful of people's space and anonymity. But as Dr. Offord knows, and probably far better than I do, there has been some shakeups with this particular initiative. There have, I'll even just talk to myself. I've been asked to moderate a number of conversations, but depending on who asked, in some cases, they want to know everything you're going to ask before you get there. And I'm like, we got to have it. If we're going to talk about this issue, it has to be organic, right? It has to be a situation where we're pushing and pulling, and we're having an opportunity to ask the fundamental question around, okay, Harvard earmarked $100 million, whatever that looks like, but we're only giving out $2 million increments, right? Mm-hmm. And so what do we have in this? We're gonna have this conversation, and then we also know, is this a 50-year initiative, right? Like, what is the goal? who's at the table is a big, and I think that goes to your other question in terms of if you're not going to be at the table around some of these fights, young brother, why engage, right? You know, why engage, right? Now, if you want to, I would say create your own table and do that. It's rooted, emotions are great, but it's rooted in metrics, it's rooted in numbers, and it's not rooted in a bunch of anecdotal stuff, because that's how they get us.
Yep.
They want us to have, you know, they want us to be rooted in these anecdotals, and they say, well, you don't have any data, right? And I think, unfortunately, that's a space where the DEI conversation has been shifted to, because it hasn't allowed us to get to the data points, or when we want to you know, have conversations around some of the systemic structures that have been there that are clear data points. Oh no, we don't mean that. And I think the last thing that I would say around these conversations, it's really hard to have them if you have nervous Negroes at the table who don't want to have the conversations, and you have complicit allies, quote unquote allies, who want to only have them when it's convenient, all right? Because far too often in these conversations, what happens is that you deal with folks who, when you leave the conversation, they say to you, I wish I had the bravery to say that. You said what I wanted to say, or why'd you say that? And there's a brother on a call with me right now. We went to a school district. I'll let that school district be nameless. Let's just say it's a big school district in Massachusetts, right? We had the opportunity to get Nicole Hannah-Jones to come to this particular district, do a presentation. The district said to us, we don't want to do the 1619 project. Okay. But there was a brother who was heading up, who was our point person, who said, did you ask my boss? You're heading this up, but you're asking me, did I ask your boss? Not once, not twice, but 3 times in a matter of 10 minutes. So there was no seriousness to really have this conversation. And I think that's part of the problem, as Dr. Offord said. You know, I work for an institution, so they could fire me, right? But you know what? You know, you know, I'm willing to do that. You know, if the work's important to me.
Yes, sir. I mean, I want to thank both of you guys again. I mean, continuously throughout the conversation. That was great, especially, I mean, we went so much deeper into the question than, I mean, as we first posited, and in a good way. I mean, as Professor Clark mentioned, these kind of conversations had to be organic for us to advance and get to somewhere that we can really evoke some sort of change, maybe not physical, but a way of thinking, a way of different interpreting these different issues and different problems. So I do want to thank you guys again.
Can I add one more thing, Nigel?
Yes.
Just to piggyback on Professor Clark's statement, one of the things that I tell people in my organization is, you know, I'm not looking for allies. I'm looking for co-conspirators, because allies can turn their allyship on and off. And so when we talk about white communities, communities of privilege, and other communities, people can decide when their allyship is turned on and turned off. What I want is someone who's not going to do that. And I think that having that conversation around what the expectations are of an ally and what that feels and looks like has to be a conversation had in the DEI space, because as we're seeing what's happening in the world right now, allyship is turned on and off depending on which way the wind blows, depends on who's in political control, depends on people feeling like they don't want to say anything or not say anything. I need people that's going to stand up for things that we know are wrong, that are hurtful, that are triggering relive trauma, and understanding all those things, and not only allow me to be the only voice to stand up, but they have to either stand up when I'm not in the room as well as when I'm in the room.
Right.
Definitely. I really like that quote. Not allies, but co-conspirators. I think that's something really important that we have to know, and that we have to recognize that, I mean, you can have people that do agree with your points of views, that do see it, but see it as more of a benefit to them in the moment versus, you know, actual core beliefs. And I think when you have these sort of co-conspirators with you, it is more people who are fully inept with the ideas that you're bringing to the table and really are looking forward to evoking change. I want to pull a couple questions from the audience. This first one from Chukwuka Okumabwa. Since Harvard's wealth and resources are the fruits of the slavery of African people, should we reclaim those fruits by sending more African-American students to these institutions such as Harvard, these PWIs that have benefited from kind of our own work and our own labor, especially since we see them as resources, or see that their resources have amassed from, and proven to produce great men like W.E.B. Du Bois, Barack Obama. These different people have benefited from PWIs. And I think even to add on to this, it brings up the idea of like, which not should we prefer, but should we prioritize sending Black people to these places to try to get reparations in a sense from these institutions and these PWIs versus, the idea of HBCUs that were built strictly, in a sense, for Black people to have a space of education. So if we could attack that question again to both of the panelists, this isn't a one or the other sort of situation, but
So I'll jump in because we talk about this a little bit in our environment. So we know from institutions that have studied slavery, Georgetown has done this tremendous descendant work as a part of their reparations or reckoning has been to offer tuition to those direct descendants and allow them to come to school for free. I don't know if that will be Harvard's response. I do know they're still doing this research around descendant communities. But one thing that I point out to people when this issue of the affirmative action case and admissions was overturned by the Supreme Court, folks who kept saying that students are going to run to HBCUs, Black students are going to run to HBCUs. And I remind people that Black students that are at HBCUs today are there because they want to be. And Harvard has always recruited the cream of crop of Black excellence. So these are students who had access to educational wealth, access to educational resources, access to an educational system that was very different than I received as a Black kid in the public school system in Chicago in a poor neighborhood. And so not that all the students that Black students come to Harvard are from that background, but even those who are extremely gifted that came from the hood like I did are coming to Harvard because Harvard recognizes the talent and Harvard wants to diversify a student body. I totally get that. And so I don't see that anything around reparations, around tuition and access is going to change the common person being able to come to Harvard unless it's connected to descendant work. And so the other piece around the $100 million, Harvard has classified it as an endowment. And so they are using, like in any endowment, the money is perpetual. It will stay locked in this endowment, and I guess until it's ever overturned. And the proceeds, annual proceeds from that is what's used to fund the projects that are happening on campus. Now, the office and some other things that the university is paying for directly, but the endowment will last on now. So I don't know futuristically what that looks like as far as access to wealth and other things for students and descendants. The last thing I'll say about this, I don't know, most folks know this, though Du Bois is an alum of Harvard, and Harvard reveres him today. In the 70s and 80s, prior to Du Bois's death and his move to Ghana to get away from the US, they had the opportunity to acquire his papers, his research, and all that information as a part of the archives. And the faculty voted no because they thought he was a communist. So Du Bois's papers are at UMass Amherst, which was his second institution. But Du Bois talked about the problems and challenges he had at Harvard, but also the Harvard faculty, even though they revere him today as a wonderful Black scholar, did not do so for his entire life. And so even as we think about Blacks who are alums of Harvard, we make the assumption that they all love Harvard and had great experiences at Harvard, and they have not. Some people have not felt a sense of belonging. Some people have not been accepted. Some people had extreme challenges, though they persevered. And so there are alums, Black and white and all other ethnicities, that are disgruntled with their Harvard experience. And that's not something that we talk about. We know that very well from the HBCU community because folks get on social media and they say it and tell it, but we don't get to hear those stories from even the other large PWIs.
I'll take it a little differently. Thank you for that. So kind of interesting. When I was in high school, so when I was your age, I had the opportunity to take classes at Harvard. And so I grew up in the area, and there was a professor at the ed school, and he had encouraged me to look at the school that I would eventually go to in Atlanta. I think that families have to sit down with themselves and figure out what's the best decision for that particular family, right? I do think that this is my own selfish opinion, your generation has done a really good job of understanding the value of race and having those conversations, maybe in a different way in which my generation talked about culture, and where we were in terms of kind of societal norms and questioning some of those things. I think your generation, my generation was really excited about maybe Obama becoming president. Your generation is having a conversation that you need an Obama to have a Trump, if you get where I'm going here, right? And so you're having those tougher conversations. And I think those conversations are being had both at, as we've seen, both at HBCUs and also at PWIs amongst Black students. So, and lastly, I'm very big on what's the cost benefit analysis, right? Go where the money is, right? And I do think, I don't understand how you guys are applying to 20, 30 schools. I don't understand that. I don't understand how you can really kind of look at that process seriously. But I think if you have applied to 10 schools, you've made a decision, you've looked at them for a number of different reasons, you have to find the best pick for you, and how that best supports you. But it's about getting the money. And then also leveraging it, right? I have a friend who I met while in college. She was doing an exchange at Spelman, but she was actually a student at Wellesley. And now, because of the experience that she had at Spelman, she loved it. Now she's a professor at Spelman. She went to Wellesley, but she also went to Spelman. So I think this idea that you have to go to an HBCU, yes, if it fits what you're looking for and the money's there, but you don't want to pay Nellie Mae and all these other folks later in life if you don't have to. Find the best fit for you, and have those conversations. And I'll end with it. I think that, I went to school in the early mid 90s, but my cousins who went to HBCUs in the early 90s, they were having different political, in late 80s, conversations. If it was apartheid, if it was obviously Coca-Cola, if it was looking at in terms of how where we're addressing economics, or just, different systems, both at the government and local levels, they were different. I think your generation is similar in that they're having those conversations. So find what's best for you.
Yes, 100%. I agree about the point of education. Obviously I'm kind of in the midst of it right now, that sort of college application process. And a lot of that is, conversations about like what is best, but also, there's good education all over the nation, whether it is your highest option or whether it is just the place that makes the most sense, from a monetary standpoint. So there is points all across the board for it. And I definitely do appreciate that. I think we're only going to do one more question, and then we're going to end up wrapping up after that. So we're going to pull this question from Mr. Frank Barnes. How do Black people go from integration to revolutionary and radical in terms of policy in the wake of racism, white supremacy, in which the government was never meant to protect? So whoever would like to attack that question first.
Okay. I think, my grandmother, my late grandmother, and there's a book, I think her name, I think it's, I'll have to find it. I'll find it while Dr. Offord speaks, but it talks about integration. And, my grandmother was very much like, I thought that Black folks did better when schools were segregated. She didn't say that she believes in segregation. She just, in terms of, I thought Black students did better because there was there was a connection to these particular students. There was a intrinsic motivation. There was, this idea in terms of, I don't want to, I don't want to disappoint somebody. I think that in terms of integration, it's a tough question to revolutionary and radical terms, is that in terms of you have to understand the rules of engagement. When you understand the rules of engagement, you know how to kind of address, how do I approach this situation? How do I approach that situation? For example, if I'm in a board meeting and I'm having a conversation, but I know that in terms of this conversation with, and I'll keep my moral imperative intact, can help the young people, you know, who are your classmates with a particular fund. So I'll give you an example. I'm looking to start this particular fund, that it's an incubator fund, and it will allow young people like yourself to start businesses, right? Obviously, you vet who you're dealing with and so on and so forth. But the idea is in terms of until I either have access to it or I'm around it, I'm not in Atlanta or DC in one of those places, I don't have access to Black capital, right? And so I have to go into these particular spaces and help them understand the value of engaging young Black folks like yourself and what is the value there. And so that's an integration particular standpoint. However, it's going to have a revolutionary impact because it's going to support young folks like yourselves. And then by turn, it's going to support generations and generations and generations. If we know that the system is set up, it's one or two things. We can either become marred by its setup, or we can understand the rules of engagement in terms of how do I push on a senator or a congressperson to get policy that's going to enact positive change in certain particular subsets of our particular community. I will not become marred in what I can't do. I will figure out in terms of how can I engage spaces to create revolutionary outcomes for people who look like us. And also some of those co-conspirators who are willing to work beside me. It's interesting to go back to Du Bois. Someone mentioned Du Bois. He said something brilliant when he was dealing with a number of particular folks. And a lot of folks talk about the NAACP and who founded it, but we don't talk about the fact that Du Bois was, they asked Du Bois and Ida B. Wells and some other folks to leave, right? They asked these folks to leave the NAACP, and they were founders of the NAACP, one of the founders, right? And part of whether, both Du Bois, Ida B. Wells, maybe Churchill, Terrell, and some other folks were questioning why you were not allowing access for particular people, particularly Black and brown folks. And part of what they came to, and Ida B. Wells writes about this, was like, look, I have to figure out how do I engage differently. And one of the ways in which she spoke to it, I got to start calling people out. And she called out Du Bois. She said, you can't be cool with me and then be my oppressor, right? We got to figure out how we engage these people to get what we want. And so I think we have to figure that out. And that's revolution. How do we engage to get what we want while understanding the rules of engagement?
I think Professor Clark summed up the answer pretty well.
Yes. We will add one more question from the Our Village Atlanta program and organization. I'll give this one to Dr. Offord to close us out. And they basically just asked, how would you suggest parents sending students to these universities impact or foster the continuation and importance of the DEI in these spaces for these young adults?
Read that one more time.
How would you suggest parents sending students to these universities impact or foster the continuation and importance of the DEI program in these spaces for our young adults?
So I agree with Professor Clark. I think families having conversations. I don't know if parents are going to say, I'm sending you to Harvard to impact DEI specifically. I think parents are going to say, I'm sending you to Harvard to get a good education, a free education. And I think the conversation with parents and families is, how do you navigate DEI as well as how do you navigate anti anything that you are? And so having those conversations and the flexibility to be able to talk with people directly on campus with their voice or connecting to their parents or community groups like Professor Clark's group, how do you find the support you need when you feel like your voice is not being heard or you feel like the essence of who you are is being violated? And I think that's what, the good old fashioned, I think about my grandfather who was, a benefactor or lived in Jim Crow, who taught me as a young Black boy how to navigate Chicago. You don't go to this neighborhood, you don't take this bus, you go over there, and I know a lot of this still happens for us even in 2024 with our kids. But it's a very different environment when it's in a classroom. When you look at power from the faculty, the power dynamics of upper class students, administrators, but really having conversations that help students navigate any of those barriers that they might experience from roommate conflicts. You're going to be most likely 9 times out of 10, a student of color is going to have a white roommate when they get to a PWI. How do you navigate conversations? And I know this is silly, but the whole conversation around face rags or not using face rags, it's all on social media, or using a bar soap, and I got to share a shower with you and my soaps. And so being able to have those conversations and navigate that is going to be important, because all too often, sometimes we either assume the passive role in that. We'll say, I want a different roommate without talking about and addressing the issues. And all of that helps you as an adult later on to be able to navigate the spaces in the workplace, or like Professor Clark, navigating those conversations at the boardroom, and you don't be like, oh, I'm going to be, what did you call it? The quiet Negro? I can't remember what.
Nervous Negro.
Nervous Negro. So we don't want you to be the nervous person of color in high school, so that you're not the nervous person of color later on in life, that you really have the tools you need to navigate and bring your voice to the table.
Great. I mean, thank you so much. With all that being said, we are going to close the panel and kind of close out the program. First, I do want to thank our two panelists, Dr. Jerome Offord and Professor Tony Clark. I want to thank you guys for being here and helping kind of have this vision that I've had and bring it to life. I want to thank the entire audience for coming and supporting throughout this time. By hosting this Juneteenth DEI Symposium, I really hope to just honor the struggles and the achievements in the past while still envisioning a more equitable future for everyone, for all people of color and everyone that is trying to pursue a higher education. I also urge you all to continue this marching towards justice, towards freedom, by sort of fostering inclusivity to all and everything you do every day in every space you enter. I want to leave you guys with a quote by Dr. Van Davis, which states that, "For me, Juneteenth represents a powerful promise that has gone unfulfilled. Even the landmark Brown v. Board of Education has not been enough to ensure equitable education for all learners. Juneteenth teaches us that proclaiming something is not enough. We must actively work to make the promises of Juneteenth and Brown v. Board of Education a reality. Educational inequity isn't a thing of the past. It persists, but it doesn't have to. We have the ability to call out educational inequity when we see it and work to eradicate it. We can create an educational system where all learners have access to the resources they need to be successful. We can fulfill Juneteenth's promise." And following that, I do just, again, want to give a great thank you to everybody for your time, your support, your help throughout this kind of brainchild that I've had. And these are much desired conversations about DEI, about culture, about belonging, and other important topics for all students, and especially students of color, that as I and others look ahead in our college experiences, hope to continue to have in order to give us the best experience overall. I really appreciate everyone's help in making this event come together. A special shout out to Our Village Atlanta and all my family and friends for sharing the registration link in today's symposium. I want to shout out again the different opportunities and different things that my panelists have going on. My Brother's Keeper Cambridge, if you would like to kind of connect and keep speaking and interacting with Mr. Tony Clark. For Dr. Jerome Offord, The Legacy of Slavery at Harvard EDU, this website that, again, both of our panelists are very interacted and involved with. I want to, again, shout out Our Village Atlanta everywhere on social media if you want to continue to have any experiences with them. And yes, everyone have a great day. Enjoy the rest of your day. Enjoy the holiday. And we thank you all for coming so much.
Thank you for having us, Nigel. And again,
thank you.
I'll follow up with you via email so I can send you a copy of the book.
Thank you, 100%. All right,
you.
everybody have a great day.
Dr. Offord.
All righty.
All right, be well.
You too, bye-bye.